Hello, this is Harry Paden. I am the host of the Paden Perspective, and I'm back again. This is episode 6, and this one will be pretty interesting if I do say so myself. The subject is going to be Immigration 101. Those of us that went to college know the 101 courses are basic. They get you into the subject of whatever courses you may be taking. So, Immigration 101, the Paden perspective, facts versus fiction. Okay, today, because this is factual based and I did a lot of research on it, I'm going to use my laptop. No mistakes here, because this is very important. Now, we know the subject, illegal immigration, came up. It's always been a subject, but it came up when there was a presidential election of 2016. A certain candidate ran. He's going to build a border. He's going to take Mexicans because they're so dangerous and all this stuff. And since then, he got elected. Whoa. But now that he's in office, he's trying to do as mandates from the Supreme President of the United States some of the things he wants to do regarding immigration. Thank goodness there's a checks and balances. He got a lot of Republicans that just are hail to the king, have no backbone, have no spine. But luckily there's some people that are standing up to him. And there always are our citizens. We have a voice, and I am one of those voices. So let's get back to the subject of immigration. Illegal immigration is not new. Immigration, believe it or not, was part of when George Washington and all the other forefathers, as they like to call themselves, forefathers of the United States, they set in place certain things, and it dealt with who could come to our borders, who could live here, and who is considered ideal as immigrants. An immigrant is a person who comes from another location to another location. So again, we know maybe George Washington and those could be labeled immigrants. Maybe they could. Of course they could. They came to a land that was already occupied. So they were certainly immigrants, but there weren't those laws in place. So naturally, there are now laws. The Naturalization Act, which was in 1790, so quite a while ago, by the first president of the United States, George Washington, it provided the first rules in the United States because, of course, Native Americans didn't have that problem prior to others coming on their shores because they were all native here. So the first rules, and this details what is a naturalized citizen, a person who can now be considered an American though they weren't born here. And this act, you might be surprised to find out, deliberately left out indentured servants. Indentured servants, many of them were, they weren't all Africans. They were people from countries that just for whatever reason weren't welcome here. Many of them were Caucasian, many of them were white. But it left out indentured servants, it left out slaves, and as I spoke about during my episode that dealt with women, it left out women. Race and immigration go hand in hand, side by side. And Congress, they eliminated the racial provisions back from the immigration laws back around 1940, 1950, but we know how that goes. They eliminated it, but people who were the people still did not treat people of certain races, certain ethnicities the way they should. So a law is a law unless it's enforced. A law is a law, but not necessarily enforced. So a law is good, but if it's not enforced, it's just a paper law. Early white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and America's forefathers, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, they, along with our president, our first president, George Washington, were very selective of who they allowed in the country. I'm going to read something to you. Why should Pennsylvania, which was founded by the English why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, this is a quote, I'm still quoting, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they acquire our complexion. Now, that was some harsh words, and it kind of subjugated those people as outsiders. And they were talking about Germans and people, coming in and Germanizing us and taking our Anglo-Saxonness away from ourselves. And just so you know, those words were the words of the great forefather of this country, Benjamin Franklin. Early Irish and Italian immigrants were discriminated for being Catholic. And the first Catholic president was, in 1960, John F. Kennedy was the first Catholic. So, there was discrimination among religion, race, ethnicity. So Catholics weren't welcome here in the very beginning. They were the Mexicans of that time. In the 19th century, Chinese immigrants to America were forbidden entry into this country by look this up, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Again, I'll say it again, in case you want to check my facts. Chinese, if you were Chinese, you couldn't come to the United States due to the Chinese immigrants, Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And then, let's get off immigration for just a second. In the early 1900s, eugenics, E-U-G-E-N-I-C apostrophe S or S. And that's the science of improving a human population by controlled breeding in order to increase a desirable heritable characteristic became popular. This was a movement. Look it up. Eugenics, E-U-G-E-N-I-C. Eugenics movement was very popular. And many of us were taught about Adolf Hitler and his, trying to have a master race. And that's what eugenics is. But way before Adolf Hitler, many in this country had a eugenics movement where they said not only dealt with color, race, where you were from, ethnicity. It also said that if you were not what they considered mentally sound, people who were born with slight learning disabilities, major learning disabilities, they did not want them to be a part of our country, because here's the theory, that if these people had babies, their babies would be defective and it would make our country defective. So they called it the eugenics movement. And Charles Davenport, again, look it up, Charles Davenport, D-A-V-E-N-P-O-R-T. He was a biologist. He founded the eugenics movement, and it was very popular in the 1900s, especially during 1920. And probably is no surprise that in 1924, there was a nationality-based quota system. Sounds kind of familiar, right? 1924, that was based on eugenics. This law put a cap on immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. See, people are discriminating based on where you come from. This had little to do with blacks as much as it did people who were of the same race that they considered inferior to them because of where they came from. So again, this law put a cap on immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. It also banned Asians. If you were Asian, you couldn't come to this country. We didn't want you here. And the eugenics, by law, permitted forced sterilization in order to keep, and it's in the wordings, y'all. Look it up. Sorry. In order to keep America pure. Make America great, keep America pure. I'm just saying. The Supreme Court gave legal support. The members of the Supreme Court backed eugenics. You know this man. We studied him in history. Justice Wendell Holmes wrote, and this is one of the chief justice of the Supreme Court. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or let them starve for imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, end quote. That's a justice of the Supreme Court who wrote that. Look it up. Okay. I don't know. But the eugenics movement began to lose power, and you're going to be maybe you'll be surprised to find out why it lost power. It lost power because of Adolf Hitler's movement to make his country pure. People saw that and said, wow, look at what he's doing over there. He wants all blonde hair, blue-eyed people, and that's not right. And the movement against him helped take the movement down. So around the 1940s, mainly due to Adolf Hitler and his eugenics movement in his country, Germany, this act was abolished, and it was something that wasn't as popular as it was during the early 1900s. And then, let's get back to our dear Mexican friends and Latin Americans. They decided to restrict another group of people who were coming, Latin Americans. And they signed an act banning Mexicans and Latin Americans, and they all were deemed illegal. That was around the 1940s. In 1965, there was another one. So we're talking about banning Latin Americans. 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act, they reopened, finally, the borders to Asian Americans. Remember I said the Asians were banned, in the early 1900s. They couldn't come over here at all. Didn't care about anything. You couldn't come over here if you were Asian. 1965, took all the way to 1965 before that was taken off the books. So now let's get to another group, the Japanese Americans. Japanese Americans, we know the history. Japan became a major world power, terroristic in nature, and they bombed Pearl Harbor. And I guess in that sense, they thought they were doing the right thing. But anyone who was Japanese, they didn't believe you could be loyal to the United States, though they were living here at the time. Many of them, were believed in America and American ways. But if you were a Japanese American, you were put in a concentration camp. They called them internment camps. And again, we have the same situation now. We're talking about youngsters being separated from their parents, being put in these places that they say are, many people are saying that they're inhumane. It's not something that was done right. So this country has always had a way of saying the only people that this country wants looks a certain way, comes from a certain area, and if you don't, this is not your country. People say go back to the country. I addressed that in my last episode. I'll go back when you go back. So nobody's going back. But let's just give a little bit of history because and I try to keep these short. Isn't it the height of hypocrisy? Look it up. Another fact. In 1885, Frederick, Friedrich, Trump, name sounds familiar. He was Donald Trump's grandfather. He came to America on a ship as an unoccupied minor. He came from a poor family. He spoke no English and did not have a high school diploma or no marketable skills. Very funny that if his grandfather, the president's grandfather, came over now, he wouldn't be allowed into the same state, the same country that his father came over, and now by the benefit of his grandfather coming over, now he has risen to the presidency of the United States. So let's always never forget that this country always has and probably always will has two sets of laws, two sets of rules. And I've said it before, and I'll continue to say it. There are people of all races who are great, so we can't label one race. But those in power want to keep power. And the only way they can keep power is by trying to finesse a way where others cannot take over from what they're doing. So if you get immigrants in the same way this immigrant came over, Frederick Trump, and his grandson became president, maybe one day we'll have a Mexican who will become president because his grandfather would have came over. But not under this administration. They don't want them here. They're building walls. They're excluding them. And, it's nothing much I can say except we have to take reality and hit reality the way reality sometimes hits us. And if you're like me, you want things because they're God ordained, not man ordained, then we have to do better. But that's just a little facts on immigration, how this country has a rich history of banning people because they didn't look like the persons who were writing the laws. Look up my facts. You can always contact me. You can always come back on and say, Paden, you're not right. That wasn't correct. I dare say I don't think that will happen because I back up what I talk about with facts. Immigration 101. I hope you took notes. See you next time. To God be the glory.